Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. Jim, you posted a blog recently about quiet quitting. And in synthesis, you can explain more about this if you want to, but it's one of the many side effects of how COVID and pandemic life in general really influence the way that we view our work and home life balance. And so the proponents of quiet quitting would say that it's a healthy drawing of boundaries around like your work expectations, essentially saying no to anything that goes above and beyond what your job responsibility and your work hours entail. But then critics see it as not just like, I don't know, they would see it as coasting in the job, or which could even lead to just coasting in life in general. And in your blog, you took a unique angle on this because you talked about what it would look like for the church to quietly quit its mission. And I thought that was a really intriguing idea because both of us, having worked in ministry for a while, you obviously much longer than I have, but we've had a front row seat to the dynamics of someone's relationship with the church and how that can change over time. You know, their involvement or their attitude about the church or their attendance and kind of how that ebbs and flows. And I had a few thoughts when I was reading your blog about some things I've been witnessing lately that I was hoping to get your thoughts on with regard to this whole quiet quitting idea. But first, you mentioned in your blog that quiet quitting is unacceptable, not acceptable for the church. And so just in case anybody hasn't read that yet, what definition of quiet quitting did you have in mind when you wrote that?
Yeah, for the church to when I began reading about this quiet quitting, I did have my mind go to thinking about what if an organization, a church did that, or its leadership did that, or people within the church did that. And so that was kind of my angle. And for a church to quietly quit, for a church to coast, to do the bare minimum, to refuse to engage the mission with every fiber of its being would just be unthinkable. And yet, you know, sometimes I can't help but feel that that's a bit of the norm. And I'm not trying to be unkind. But I also, there comes a time to say, almost prophetically that where this is happening, it needs to stop. You do have churches who are content with their size and content with their impact and their influence, and they're content with status quo. In fact, they work very hard to preserve status quo. And you do have pastors. I mean, the vast majority. I would pray not, but you still run across pastors who mail in their messages, lead at the pace of greatest ease, and attenders who are more concerned with their needs being met than they are with seeing someone far from God come to faith. So there's just I talked in the blog about how there's just a lack of intensity, and I couldn't help but have my mind go to the last of the 7 letters in the book of Revelation, and how that it was famously condemned for being lukewarm. And it was interesting that Jesus says, "I wish you're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were one or the other, but you make me want to retch." And literally, the Greek was, "It sickens me so much being lukewarm, it makes me want to vomit, and I want to vomit you out of my mouth." And which is what the word spit meant in the Greek word that was used there. So, we can have, fun, cultural conversation about whether quiet quitting is just about protecting yourself against burnout or about slacking off. But let's just agree that when it comes to the mission of the church, being lukewarm, any type of quiet quitting is simply not an option.
Now, so as you mentioned, some people would say that, it can be a healthy thing because it does prevent burnout. And so quiet quitting is almost like in response to that. Like, I've been working so much, I need to draw boundaries. But it's interesting when you take that analogy to the church, because do you think that's what some people would say, like proponents of quiet quitting within a church atmosphere, that it's
because they've dealt with so much burnout, or they want to draw these boundaries beyond, what they're comfortable with, or what they're not doing more than is expected of them because they're afraid that they're going to burn out?
Yeah, I think there's two scenarios. I think we could talk about it in two ways. And first, there's the COVID scenario of like for pastors.
Hmm.
Um, it was interesting what was called the Great Resignation throughout 2021, where more Americans left their jobs than ever before. More Americans left their jobs in April, for example, of 2021 than any other month on record. Then that record was broken in July of 21, and then that record was broken again in August, and which was then broken again in September. I mean, it was just this massive resignation, and it was called the Great Resignation. And I remember reading something in the Atlantic about that that those who are quitting, many of them were low wage workers just getting better jobs in industries that are raising wages to get desperately needed new employees. So it was more of a big switch than a big quit in a lot of sweat settings. But for many, it was burnout. It was related to burnout. People in jobs that were particularly hard hit by all things COVID. So think educators, healthcare workers, and pastors. It was interesting how even the secular press was picking up on the impact that all of this was having on church leaders. Washington Post, I remember reading an article about an exodus of clergy that was going on that have left ministry in the last couple of years because of the powerful combination of pandemic demands and political stress. Fights about masks and vaccine mandates and how far a religious leader should go in expressing a political view, and whether, using Zoom and all of this. Pastoral burnout just got really high. And they were right. There was a survey by Barna that I found very unsettling and really disturbing to my soul and my spirit. Found that 38% of all Protestant pastors said that they had considered quitting full-time vocational ministry in the past year. And that was up almost 10 points from when Barna asked the same question at the beginning of 21. And when you bracket out age groups, an alarming almost 50%, I think it was like 46%, but almost 50% of all pastors under the age of 45 are thinking of quitting ministry altogether. Almost half of the next generation. And so that's serious. That's burnout. And there's so many things that they're facing, obviously, with that, pandemic and polarization and discussions of race and so many other issues. And so these deep polarizations have been difficult for pastors because no matter what the issue, no matter what the decision, that leader was going to alienate one group or another in the church. And it was like a no-win scenario. And yet they were unavoidable decisions and issues to speak out on.
Sure.
Conspiracy theories, sweeping the congregation, getting vaccinated, open or closed, masked or unmasked, the 2020 election, the response to the death of George Floyd. Added to that, with the shift of all things digital,
Sure.
Which was not a skill set taught in seminary, and the social isolation that pastors felt in relation to the practice of ministry. So I'm deeply sympathetic to that. But then here's what I'm not sympathetic to, and this is really what I was trying to get at, is apathy. Just apathy toward the mission, losing sight of the mission, not having a burning fire in you for the mission. And I it's funny. I was reminded of this earlier today. I was doing a podcast for a friend of mine in the UK, and I had forgotten about this story. It kind of came out in a serendipitous way as we were chatting. But many, many, many years ago, I was leading a seminar, and I was laying out, my heart, my passion for the church and how it could reach the unchurched. And if we'd only do this and try that, I was just kind of, pouring my passions out for that, for a real rethinking of the church and a real sense of moving forward. And a pastor stopped me afterward, kind of caught me as I was leaving, and in the hallway. And he kind of pulled me aside and he said, "Everything you said was true. Everything you said was right, but I'm not going to do any of it because I only got I don't know, 6, 7, 8 more years, and before I'm done, and I just don't want the headache. I don't want the hassle, and I'm just not going to do it. But everything you said was right and true. And I remember I had two simultaneous reactions. One was I didn't know whether to just find a corner and throw up, sick to my stomach and heart sick, or just haul off and deck this guy. Because it's like, this is just so, it made me manic. So it's the apathy. And I just think that was what I was trying to go after, that kind of quiet quitting.
Yeah. Now, when you apply quiet quitting to a work situation, quiet quitting is usually described as not going beyond your job description. But that's a hard thing to nail when you're talking about the church, like what someone's job description is, especially if they're not on staff for a church or they're not, a pastor. And so I think you could probably broadly say, well, our job is what you just said, the mission, the Great Commission. But how do you put that in identifiable terms?
So interesting that you bring quiet quitting to like a church attender, or how that would be for a church member. Because I didn't go there in the blog,
right.
And that's not the way it's being used in terms of marketplace and everything. But I think it's fascinating. So thank you for throwing me a softball pitch. Let me respond to that, but let me preface my response with this: the church I have the privilege of leading is the most selfless, sacrificial, turned outward, not inward group of people on the planet. I could not be more proud. And they get it. People met get it. They know it's not about them primarily, about the person who's not even darkened the doorstep of the church yet. And they would die to themselves and do, anything to see a friend or a family member or someone even they don't know just emerge from the waters of baptism. And so I want to preface what I'm going to say by saying I'm not talking about MEC. If anything, I just would want to brag about MEC. Mm-hmm. But I also travel a lot, and I talk to a lot of pastors, and I know what the state of a lot of churches are and what they're dealing with, and it's deeply troubling. And here's how I would describe it in terms of the quiet quitting and what's happening and their understanding of their job. Mm-hmm. They don't have an understanding of a job. There's two things that are combined: a terribly weak ecclesiology and then spiritual narcissism. Mm-hmm. And I really, since you've given me the opportunity, I want to talk about both.
Sure.
Weak ecclesiology, meaning they just don't have a high view of the church. They view the church as just, a glorified country club or something that's optional to do. I mean, it's nice to be a part of, but they don't really see it as the bride of Christ, the cause of Christ, the thing that Christ came to establish to reach this world. They have a very low view of it that's very consumer driven, consumer based. They just want to go and get needs met and maybe good children's ministry stuff and some inspiring music and a good talk every now and then, and meet some friends. And they don't really view it as something that they are to give their life to. So they have a very weak ecclesiology. They kind of a take it or leave it kind of thing when it comes to the church. And they don't really kind of see it almost like a man-made organization, all of which is patently false and is borders on heresy. But then it's combined with spiritual narcissism. And I have been ringing the bell about spiritual narcissism, I feel, for a quarter of a century. Narcissus in Greek mythology was the person who so fell in love with their image that they were just taken with themselves. And in various versions of the story, he comes across a pool of water, sees his reflection, and is so taken with himself, he just spends the rest of his life staring at his image. From that, we get our word narcissism, this I, me, mine mentality that puts our wants and needs ahead of everything, and getting our personal tastes and desires satisfied ahead of everything. And so this spiritual narcissism plays itself out when it comes to the church. And so when you listen to people, they'll say things like, well, I want to go where I'm fed. It's an incredibly narcissistic thing to say, because they're not saying, I want to go where I can learn to feed myself or where I can feed others. No, I just want to be fed. Or I'll walk out of a worship service and say, well, I didn't get anything out of it. As if worship is what you got out of it as opposed to what you gave God through it. They'll talk about, well, I need to go where my needs are met, not where I can meet other people's needs or where, I can, learn how to do that. No, I just need my needs met. Or I need to go where I can be served, and as opposed to me serving others. So it's the way we talk, it's very narcissistic, but we don't even blush because we're not even labeling it as narcissistic. Yeah. It's just, it goes back to our weak ecclesiology. Of course, it's going to be my approach to the church. It's going to be my approach to spirituality. I'm a consumer. And so I don't have a job. You have a job to care for me and whatever I want. I don't have a job. You're lucky I showed up. You're lucky I'm here. And maybe I'll give you a tip during the offering if I feel like so led. So it is, and I know I'm being borderline almost snarky about this, and I don't mean to be, but I'm talking about, I'm setting up not a straw man, but I'm setting up something to tear down.
Sure.
And I do think that spiritual narcissism invades the church. A lot of people feel like some, large churches, contemporary churches, are abandoning orthodoxy to get warm bodies, and therefore they're giving into a consumer mindset. I would argue no. It's I mean, the consumer mindset that's invaded the church is where we're catering to the needs of the already convinced everything. We're not just trying to do whatever it takes to get unchurched in and abandoning orthodoxy. We're doing everything we can to get transfer growth in by catering to their needs. And I think it's a insidious type of consumerism because it negates the mission. It goes against the mission because it's not about me. It's not about you. It's about lost people. Yeah. And we're to have a towel over our arm and to selflessly serve. We're talking about a Savior who said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. And a Savior that said, take up your cross daily and follow me. And on it goes. A Savior who gave his very life for the mission and for those who were lost. So the truth is that every Christian is going to stand before God and give an account of their life. And that's going to include their role and their participation in the bride of Christ, and the use of their gifts and their resources for the church, and the outreach to friends and family and their participation in the church. In essence, I don't know how it's going to play out, but it could be as simple as we had an army. You were recruited for that army. Did you fight? It's kind of like, we see things that are playing out right now in the Ukraine and how these people are just doing everything they can to save their country and recapture their country. And there's no sense that you wouldn't. What do you mean? We're fighting for our country. I mean, who's not going to be a part of this? Yeah. And the church is far much more. Mm-hmm. And it's met with apathy and a spiritual narcissism. And so that's I think the quiet quitting plays itself out along those lines.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said, like the church is so much more. And I've been thinking about that with relation to quiet quitting, because the one part I do like about quiet quitting with regards to the workplace is that it does suggest that, as you draw, it's necessary to draw boundaries around your work because there's more to life than work. You shouldn't be spending all of your time, putting in, all these extra time and hours into your job, forsaking other things that are important. But like you said, like with the church and God's mission, what is more important than that? And so how does a Christian, properly, discern for them what is too much? What would that look like for them?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're giving me an opportunity to qualify because, somebody could say, oh, yeah, but I mean, now you're talking burning out for Jesus, and that's not good either, and that's not balanced. And we're God wants us healthy and whole and doing life in a sane pace. And I agree with all of that. I'm talking about an inner spirit. I'm talking about an inner attitude. I'm not talking about putting in 40 hours at your job and then somehow finding another 40 where you're living at a church or something like that. I'm just talking about, being active in the bride of Christ, active in the church, active with the mission, putting in your gifts and your resources and your time and your talent, and being a part of the team and being a part of the effort and the cause of Christ, and taking it seriously as the church is the most important investment you'll make in your life. And I do believe that. I do believe the cause of Christ is the most important thing you'll invest in your whole life. So, but I also, as you know, talk regularly with even our staff, how not to burn out, how to protect your family life, how to have your children grow up loving the church instead of resenting the church, and how to be careful not to operate too much outside of your areas of primary giftedness, because of how that can be draining and toxic. And so I very much care about that. But I was also talking with one of our older staffers, and who said that one of the things too, though, that attracted him to Mac and was the intensity, the urgency of that flowed through the veins of this place, of all of us collectively doing whatever it took. Hey, if it did take coming here and giving time, and if it did mean sacrificial giving, if it did mean just a whatever it takes mentality, because the mission was so clear and so urgent. And so there is that sense of, yes, sane, balance, health, but also passion, urgency, doing whatever it takes. And so I think it's an internal conviction and orientation.
The term quiet quitting actually became quite loud because of influencers on TikTok in particular, who were, posting videos about how to, slack off on the job. It basically gave a different perspective as to quiet quitting, which I think is the most under fire. And the analogy may break down here, so you tell me if I'm overstretching this, but is there an equivalent of like a loud quitter like that within the church?
Oh yeah, and again, I want to brag on Meckers. I just don't encounter this here, but yeah, I mean, like I get around a lot, and I talk to a lot of pastors, and one of the things that I've heard a lot of pastors kind of tell me privately offline, that they're older members and attenders really have a mindset many times of, hey, I've done my part. It's time for the young kids to do theirs. I've done my time in the nursery, or I gave sacrificially at that campaign, or I've done this, or I've done that, and it's now their turn. I've done my part, and that's kind of a loud quit. That's kind of a bold, loud quit. And also when someone says, I'm out of here, I want to go where I'm fed, all the spiritual narcissistic stuff that actually leads to a departure, and they're just very out front about it. That's a loud quit. And again, this isn't true of Mac, but I mean, it's certainly true of I mean, I guess it could be true. I wouldn't know. I don't think it is, but I do know that in a lot of churches, they'll say that anytime they announce that they're going to have a building campaign, where they really they're growing, they're reaching people for Jesus, they're baptizing people, and they need to raise capital funds for either facilities or resources, or maybe online efforts, or various things like that. In other words, they just need to have some type of capital campaign. And it's hard to really extend the cause of Christ and really get chunk yardage independent of those, and so as a leader. But they'll say, I can just tell you right now, anytime I start to do something like that, I can count on 20 to 30% reduction in attendance. That's pretty loud quitting.
Sure.
And so, and it's interesting. All of that's mission related, isn't it? So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stretch the definition of quiet quitting a little bit to essentially what it just sounds like if you're not familiar with it, just a literal understanding of it, to like quietly walk away from something. And with relation to the church, that would be people who just quietly leave the church and they stop attending. I get it. This is totally normal, or I guess we'd be used to this for people who are new attenders at a church. But I think that the larger church at large was shocked by how much this happened, after COVID, especially with some of their core volunteers or attenders who they thought that, once regulations are lifted and everybody can come back, all those volunteers and everybody, they're just going to come right back again. And that didn't happen. And it wasn't just that they scaled back, that they drew boundaries around their, their time or their energy, but just that they quietly quit without a trace. What do you think is behind that?
I would encourage people, if they didn't, to listen to our podcast on deconstructing, because some of that was addressed there. Like, what are the reasons why that people are deconstructing? And some of the reasons why people, detach themselves from the local church. I think there's several things that were going on. That one was that prior to COVID, you really did have this rise of the nuns. I mean, this full-throated entry into a post-Christian world, and COVID just accelerated everything. And so you might have you had a lot of people on the periphery of churches that might have attended periodically, but, COVID just accelerated everything, including people's lack of religious faith or lack of religious attachment. Churches were closed for a certain period of time in terms of in-person services, and people on the periphery just kind of fell off. They just kind of naturally, they weren't that attached anyway. And so it was very almost natural for them to just have the separation that was already hanging by a thread and wasn't that convictional to just end. And so COVID just gave them the cultural kitchen pass to do that, and the cover, so they wouldn't look bad. I mean, and, others, I think, just got sick of the toxic mess that invaded a lot of churches, partisan politics and so many other different things, and the divides and the open conflicts between Christians, and they just said, "Oh my gosh, I don't want anything to do with that." And their church was, heavily embroiled in those kinds of things. I think another thing, for churches that had a really robust online presence and maintained that robust online presence, I think a lot of it is they didn't quietly quit. They just stayed online. They just thoroughly enjoyed it, and many of the natural ways to surface became, irrelevant to them, or they were comfortable with certain things. And it's interesting at Mac, we've experienced that, and I don't think we've had a chance to talk about this much, but like we had an online campus long before COVID, and we still have the vast majority of our people. We grew significantly during COVID, but still the vast majority of our people attend the online campus. They simply enjoy it. They simply like it. And we're okay with that. We've made it clear that that's whichever campus, in person or online, that serves your needs. And for us, it's a full campus. I mean, it's the pastors and guest services and online stuff. We've gone all in on hybrid, which again we'll be talking quite a bit more probably in the months to come. But they didn't go anywhere. They're still there, and so they just didn't return to in-person services, and they just love being online. And but what we found too is that when there were opportunities to surface, such as like we had one event that we offered, like it was actually in the thick of COVID, and we had over 10,000 people show up for that one, and then we had to cap it. We don't know how many would have come, but and so they just kind of pick and choose what they're going to do. So they haven't quit; they've just gone into a different model of engagement with the church. So I think there's all of the above in terms of this. I do think that there's a lot in the deconstruction stuff that we talked about that I do think led to some quiet. I don't know if I would say quitting, but like I'm going to take a sabbatical. I'm going to take a breather. I'm just going to back off for a little while. I need to reassess some things. And many of them might still be attending online or viewing things online, but there was so much, and we talked about this too, bundled with Christianity over the last 3 years. And I think inappropriately that was projected out on the typical local church, even though it wasn't involved in those bundlings, that people are just trying to sort through a lot. It's been a crazy 36 months across the board. And I was, I was talking to my friend from the UK. We were doing this podcast together. And the way he was saying it says, this happened in COVID, this happened, and this happened. And then the Queen, he was like our queen. And for them, they've never known life without that mother figure. Gosh. I mean, this was a man who's, I think he was in his 40s or 50s. And I mean, she was queen 20 years before he was born. Yeah. And so, it's just like there was, I mean, that was they're just in a funk
Yeah.
And and the way he said that, there was this, and then the Queen.
Yeah.
I just, um,
We've been through a
and
lot, that's for sure.
yeah,
Hmm. I wonder how much quiet quitting takes place without people even realizing it. Like, I can't imagine that like most people become Christians, or most Christians consciously turn inward, or, new pastors are thinking, oh man, I can't wait, for a couple years down the road where I get to just coast. Like, how does that happen to someone without realizing? How do they move in, you mentioned like in an apathetic area, and how can we prevent that from happening?
it's what we expose ourselves to, and it's who we're around. If I am not exposed to people in my life who challenge me with their commitment, with their investment, with their urgency, with their sacrificial approach, I can get more and more comfortable with whatever level I've set for myself. And so I do think that the more we are isolated away from those challenges, the more we can just drift. And left to ourselves, we'll drift to narcissism. Left to ourselves, we'll drift to a self-centered approach. And so we just need to, and that's one of the reasons why we reach a point where we don't even hear ourselves sounding narcissistic. We don't even see the way we're living as narcissistic because we're not being exposed to anything else that isn't narcissistic. And and uh, and sometimes when people get exposed to it, they almost can get angry because they don't want to be convicted. Don't tell me I'm a bad person or I'm for saying this or feeling this way, because we've almost made narcissism a euphemism for or a metaphor for taking care of myself.
Right.
And we've made self-therapy and taking care of myself, like the ultimate value. Like I just need me time. I need to care about me. I just need assignment seasons for me. And you don't, and it's just a veiled way of just being self-absorbed. And you can care for yourself in the proper ways and still lead a sacrificial given lifestyle. Jesus was the perfect model for that. Completely sacrificial, completely death to self, but he took care of himself. He had down times, he had quiet times, he had, he took care of himself. There was an old story, and I want to say I got this from John Stott, but I can't remember
Okay. We'll
whether
look
he
it
was the
up.
one that told me this, or whether he was the one that told me this, or or maybe I read it in one of his books. But I'll give him credit just because I know it's not original with me. But there was a guy in a church who had been in a church who had stopped attending and stopped interacting with community, and was kind of justifying that, and it just had taken further and further away. And his pastor went to see him, and he didn't say anything to the guy. He just kind of went in the story, and the guy was in front of the fire, and the pastor took a poker, and he moved one of the coals, the out from the fire, and he about a couple of feet, and he just let it be there, and in just a few moments, it went from red to pink to then just white ash when he had moved it away from the other coals. And then he left. And the man knew exactly what he was saying. This is what you're going to be like, removed from others, removed from community, removed from people who would challenge you. You're not supposed to do this alone. You will lose your fire. You will be like this, that was once on fire and now is dead. John told it a lot better, but I'm just testing my memory on that one. I don't know why it just came to me, but I do think that it can happen unconsciously. We removed from that, we'll just slowly, and so and that's really what the verse is about when it says, "Don't give up meeting together." In Scripture, that wasn't corporate worship; it was don't remove yourself from Christian community. Don't remove yourself from the one another's and the way you're to interact with one another and the way you challenge one another, iron against iron motivation. And so, so if you really want to keep this not from happening, don't remove yourself from Christian community, and also, seek out people that are going to challenge you. And I've throughout my life, I've usually had people that I can go spend time with, and I walk away just okay. I'm going to re-up. I'm challenged again to be more bold in my faith, or to read more, or to lose weight, or to exercise, or for good purposes, or to lead with more prayerful clarity, and that's a wonderful thing, and that's what it's meant to do. Or Christian community, you're meant to have challenge come to you from other people, and I think that's the ultimate thing about quiet quitting. You put 5 people in an office, and you've got 4 quietly quitting, and then the 5th person isn't.
Yeah.
And really can motivate the other 4 in terms of having a higher purpose and an urgency and an intensity.
That's a great example. And I love that story about the coal. I feel like that's worth reflecting on a little bit more as well. So thank you for that. Or John Stott, whoever that came from, but thank you.
Uncle John.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's great. I think that's a good place to leave today's conversation. And of course, we'll link that blog that this was based on in the show notes, but we'll leave it there for now. Thank you guys for joining us, and we hope that you'll tune in next week.